Well, it didn't snow. I just want y'all to know that. But it's the old saying, if you don't like the weather in Georgia, just wait a few days. Gosh, that is so true. I find that truer every year. So, but we're happy to have all of you here tonight, and I appreciate you coming out. It's our meeting on Georgia flexibility options. We appreciate you being here. It shows your interest in our school system and also in the education of your children. It's my pleasure tonight to introduce our presenter, Dr. Howard Hendley, who is the project director for the Georgia Department of Education. Before I do that, though, I almost forgot. I've been asked to recognize the board members that are here tonight. I'm Peggy Andrews. I'm a board member. We have with us Michael Coward, our board chair, Delane Lewis, our vice chair, Daniel Bell, member, Byron Long, member, and our superintendent, Dr. Little May Perry. So they're all down here front if you need them or need to ask anything or whatever. Dr. Hendley, as I said, is the policy director with the Georgia Department of Education. He has extensive educational experience. He's been a classroom teacher, a principal, a superintendent, and now works directly with Richard Woods, who's our state school superintendent. Dr. Hendley has served as principal for Tri-County High School, principal for Americas High School, principal of Dublin High School, superintendent of Jeff Davis County Schools, superintendent of Thomaston-Uxton County, and also he's worked with the Georgia Department of Education for about 8 years. Dr. Hendley obtained his doctorate from the University of Georgia. Tonight we're going to learn about our options, our flexibility options, which are IE2, charter system, and status quo. Dr. Hendley's presentation will tell us these things. What do we mean by each of these? Why are we required to choose? What this will mean for our school district, and who decides whether we choose IE2, charter system, or status quo. Earlier this year, Dr. Hendley worked with our board and the superintendent to help us thoroughly understand our options as well as the process. And he's done this with many superintendents and boards across the state. He also focuses on what I believe is the most important, on factual and non-biased information, so you can expect to hear that tonight. Consequently, the board and superintendent asked if he would come and share this information with you all. He usually does not present to the communities, but in our case, he did a favor for us, and we're happy to have them. So please join us in welcoming Dr. Howard Hendley. Give him a good Pickens County welcome, okay?
Thank you so much. It's great to be in Pickens County tonight. You have an absolutely beautiful facility here with this auditorium. It is just a wonderful place for your community. It speaks volumes about you and what you're already doing. Again, thank you, board members. Thank you, Dr. Perry, for having me again tonight. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. You know, when I used to be where you would be and people would come from Atlanta and someone would introduce this person comes from Atlanta, they've got something to talk to you about. My first thought was, well, has this person ever been around a student? Have they ever seen a student? And obviously you heard my introduction I have, and I just kind of go back very briefly, but my first principalship was in 1985. I was the principal of a school called Tri-County High School, left there to be principal of Americas High School for 6 years, was actually interim superintendent there for the last 6 months of that 6-year period, left there to be the principal at Dublin High School, left there to be Superintendent Jeff Davis County, left there to be Superintendent Tom Stutson, left there to work at Kathy Cox, our former state superintendent's help desk. Now I've been for the last 5 years the policy director of the Department of Education. Now, I say that to you because I promise you I'm reading everyone's expression right now, and you're falling into one of two camps. There's some of you who are thinking, wow, what a wealth of experience. This person can certainly help us tonight. And then there are others that are thinking, wow, this guy cannot keep a job. So I'll let you decide at the conclusion which one that I actually fall into. But we do have, your board has, and I'm so glad that they have asked you to be part of their decision-making process. Your board has a very big decision. As I was saying to your chairman earlier, it's really setting the stage for the next generation or generations. So it's of that magnitude. So I'm delighted that they have hosted this community event to get your input, to get your thoughts on what you have to do. Now I want to go ahead before I even put the presentation up, because one of the thoughts that was in the introduction was, why are we having to make this decision? Let's talk about that just a minute. It goes back to a piece of legislation that happened in the General Assembly in 2008. And in that General Assembly, there was a flexibility bill which was passed. And in 2008, the Georgia General Assembly basically said that districts will have to choose to be an IE2, an Investing in Educational Excellence district or charter district, or they'll have to declare themselves status quo at a public meeting. We're going to talk a lot more about what those three terms are and what they mean to you. But the genesis actually does go back to the 2008 Georgia General Assembly. Now sometimes, and I know right now, we are in a session of the Georgia General Assembly. In fact, we're in day 32, I believe, was today of the 40-day session. So everything I say is a little qualified in that something could change even during this session. There are many things I do not think will change, but it certainly is possible that they could change. So keep that in mind as we go through the presentation. But at that time, they did think it was important to let school districts have the ability to innovate and certainly the ability to leverage resources, which your board can do through a flexibility contract. So, move forward a little bit more before I start with the presentation. So in front of your board, there's a binary choice. A binary means a 0, 1, yes or no, off or on. There's a choice of flexibility or no flexibility. If they choose no flexibility, then you become status quo, and really we're just about finished with the presentation. We can go home. That's the end of it. If they choose flexibility, then they have another binary decision to make. 0, 1, yes, no, on or off. Either IE2 or charter system. Now, IE2 stands for Investing in Educational Excellence. And again, I think as the person that came up and introduced me said that that was a result of one of Governor Perdue's initiatives during the time that he was governor. The words investing in educational excellence did not occur in the statute, but the words flexibility occur multiple times in the statute. So that's one of the selections that you can make is for that investing in educational excellence. So that's a flexibility option, or charter system is a flexibility option, or status quo. Now, again, in all fairness, to be as not to be disingenuous, but to be as candid as I can with you, I said earlier that there may be some things that change in the Georgia General Assembly this year. Naming of those operational models could be there. There is a bill over there, an attachment that would rename status quo and perhaps call it right now, and the bill is just a placeholder, but perhaps traditional funding, just nomenclature, just changing what that would be called, that's all. Another one, possibly IE2, there's a possibility that it could be renamed strategic school system, that's all. Many people think, though, that the date might be pushed out. And Dr. Perry, I think I saw you at the GALE conference, the Georgia Association of Educational Leaders. I deliberately went to hear what Lindsay Tippins, the chairman of the Education and Youth Committee on the Senate side, and what Brooks Coleman, the chairman of the House Education Committee, I deliberately went to hear what they had to say. I didn't hear any indication of any movement of the date. I didn't hear any. So I think the date is what we have. Now the reason people think that date may change is because it did change. If I had the bill, which I do have, in my briefcase, the original bill called for this decision to be made by June 30, 2013. So it's been moved 2 years to June 30, 2015. So many people believe that it would be moved again. I don't think it's going to move again. I think it is what we have. So the lay of the land, again, just before we get into this, so you know, that right now there are 28 school districts in Georgia who have an executed charter system contract. 28. There are another 18 to 19 that have letters of intent to become a charter system. Right now there are 4 investing in educational contracts in effect. Those being Raven County, Gwinnett County, Forsyth County, and Cobb County. They have executed contracts. They're under contract as we talk. There are now about 40 districts who have elected or have a letter of intent on file now to become an investing in educational excellence. So there's been a renewed interest in investing in educational excellence. I will say this to you, and I don't know that I said this to the board the first time I talked to them, but we went 6 years in Georgia since that 2008 passage of the bill. And we had 3 investing in educational excellence systems, 3 in 6 years, those being Forsyth, Rabun, and Gwinnett County. So we knew that there was something going on out there the districts, for whatever reason, didn't want to choose. So there have been some changes to investing in educational excellence, some rather significant changes. So once those changes have occurred, and you'll see those tonight, that has, again, I believe, caused there to be great interest in investing in educational excellence, to the extent now that we now have 40 plus letters of intent to become investing in educational excellence. I probably have talked to another 3 to 5 districts this past week who are about to submit their letters. 2 or 3 disclaimers, maybe 2 disclaimers before I start the presentation. Number 1 is my role, and I've told this to the board earlier. My role is not to sell this district. It's not to come tell Pickens County this is what you do. It's certainly not. That's their role, based on the input they receive from the principals and from the community. My role is just to tell you, here are the 3 operational models. Here's the selection from which you may choose. That's the extent of what I will be doing tonight with you. Another disclaimer, though, is many times when I put a slide up, many times I will actually read the slide. I don't do that out of disrespect. I don't do that to offend anyone, but it is important that we maintain consistency of the message. So many times I will do that. So again, please don't be offended when I do that. And with that, we'll just go ahead and start. I will, maybe one other disclaimer, I will spend more time on investing in educational excellence. I'll spend a good bit more time. Now again, that's not to say this is more important. That's not, again, my role to tell you which is more important or which is better for your county or your school system. The reason that I spend more time is there have been more changes there. There are a lot of changes, and it will take me some time to impress upon you what those changes are and what those changes entail. So I will spend more time on investing in educational excellence. There have not been many changes with charter. So what we had a year ago is essentially what we have now. That's not the case with investing in educational excellence. So we'll just march right on in. Obviously, of great importance to Pickens County, just like any other county, is the bottom line, which is academics. How students, I see there are many students here tonight, how you perform in the classroom, how you achieve, what your board members, and I promise you, your board members ran to be school board members because they were concerned about you. They were concerned about this next generation. They want Pickens County to be a place where students can graduate from this high school and they can get a job in Pickens County if they choose to, or if they choose they can go elsewhere. But it's really bigger than a school improvement, student achievement issue. It's really a quality of life issue. So again, the stakes are very high. It is very important as we again set the stage now for a generation. Title 20, if I can. This is Title 20. This is the code book. This is the legal code for public education, the official code of Georgia annotated, OCGA. And you see this is a very thick book I'm holding up. And if I open this book up, the font is very small, very small. Now I say that to you for this reason. There's a lot of governance language that applies to public education, K-12. A lot of governance language. A lot of laws that govern public K-12 education. Now, as if that weren't enough, if we go to the Georgia Department of Education website and you go to the State Board of Education, you'll see something called State Board Rules. Well, there'll be another 154 State Board Rules in addition to this language. So as you can see, it really begins to compound itself, and then if we drill down further, every one of those rules has a number. It's a little blue link. If you touch that blue link on rules, you'll get another document, a guidance or guideline document with additional governance language. A classic case for you educators out there, if you're familiar with something called Early Intervention Program, the EIP program. If you were to click on that guideline document, there's another 15 to 20 pages that give you the delivery models that you have to use in Pickens County or any other county in Georgia, that you have to use those models. So here's my point. Yes, it's a benefit to have relief from that. There is benefit to the district to say, here's some students in our school system that need remediation. Let's apply that remediation in the way that we think best, and we don't have to use one of these delivery models. We think we have a better way to do it. That's a benefit. Now again, is it worth setting these higher targets. That's what you have to do as a board and superintendent. You've got to think about that. What do I need to get that flexibility, and how high a target do I have to set to get that flexibility? So that's Title 20. It's a very comprehensive, a very thick document. The flexibility here is the freedom granted through waivers of Title 20 law, rules, and guidelines. So again, if you engage in that binary decision, if you choose flexibility contract, you can get relief from a lot of the language in that book, a lot. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that as we go through the program. The flexibility operations, these are the operational approaches that school systems can take. Those would be the investing in educational excellence, the charter system, or the status quo. The big four that I would just surmise that members of the General Assembly in 2008 thought as they passed that law, well, here are 4 laws that if we give them relief, this will entice districts to choose one of these. So they listed them as class size, expenditure control, certification, and salary schedule requirements. Now, for those who like school finance, that expenditure control is a very interesting one. It's another one that we call the 65% rule. The 65% rule says that all the revenues that Pickens County collects has to be spent on direct instruction. That's another discussion for another day, what goes into direct instruction. Probably that doesn't have the meaning in Pickens County that it may have in other counties, because there are a number of ways that you can be compliant with that rule. You can be compliant with that rule academically, so you need not spend 65% to be compliant. If your average SAT score exceeds the state average, you're compliant with that rule. If your average graduation rate exceeds the state average, then you are compliant with that rule. So there are a number of ways that that can occur. The performance contracts, these are investing in educational excellence and charter system contracts. They have 2 main parts, the academic and other targets to which the school district is committed. The charter system, if that's what you choose, they will implement to enable it to meet its higher academic goals, and there's an agreement on the decision-making authority granted to local school governance teams. Now, this is a good time to do this. When we're talking about the flexibility options, this is a good time to differentiate. That statement right there just made me think about this. Local school governance teams are very important in charter, very important. Not that they're not important in IE2, but they're so important in charter they're required. You have to have, if you adopt charter system, you must have local school governance teams. These would be similar to what you have already with your school councils, but their authority is more formalized. They have greater authority. They do make recommendations to the Board of Education. So that's a very important distinction. IE2, you can have as much school governance as you want. If you choose charter, you must have school level governance teams in place. The important distinction between those 2 operation systems. This is just a visual that outlines the bargain again. And on the left-hand side, you see the accountability. On the right-hand side, you see greater autonomy. On the left-hand side, you have higher academic expectations. On the right-hand side, you have flexibility to innovate. On the left-hand side, you see something called CCRPI. That's the College Career Ready Performance Index, and beating the odds performance measures. We'll talk more about beating the odds here in just a minute. And then on the right-hand side, you have the freedom from the state controls that I talked about. One thing I need to say too, because I'm always afraid I will forget to say this. Many times when I have done this presentation across the state, and I don't apologize for this because this state's been through a tough time economically, a very tough time. School districts have had to struggle to make ends meet, to make payrolls. So many times I dwell on cost savings and savings when I talk about investing in education, excellence, and charter systems. Now, I'm not talking about savings like the end of the year when you put money in the bank. No, not at all. I'm talking about being able to leverage resources. Being able to say, this is the size of our educational pie. This is the finite number of dollars that we have in our educational pie in Pickens County. But because we have flexibility, we can carve this pie up. We can slice this pie in different ways, and some pieces may be bigger. Perhaps we do really, really well in 4th grade reading and not so well in 5th grade math. So we can divert those resources to the places that we really need them, and that's what your flexibility contract will let you do. So I say that because I don't want to ever imply that it's all about the savings, because a lot of it is about the savings, but it's also about your ability to innovate. There may be times when you have a rule or a law in place that if you didn't have that rule or law, you could do more, you would have more latitude. So again, they're very important. The ability to innovate and the cost savings part. Again, just another visual to let you know the magnitude of the decision is very great because there are some big moving parts in place. There's the June 30th, 2015 deadline that was put into law in the 2008 Georgia General Assembly session, although at that time it had 2013. 2 years ago, that date was moved to 2015. We're going to dwell tonight, we're not going to talk about number 4 and 5. We're going to confine our discussion tonight to 1, 2, and 3. Those being the investing in educational excellence, the charter system, and the status quo school system. Again, I'll spend a little, actually a good bit more time on I-squared simply because that's where the changes have taken place. So for an investing in educational excellence system, the flexibility granted does not include a requirement for school level governance. Again, it's not required that. You can have that, but it's not required, as opposed to charter, where it is a requirement. GaDOE is the abbreviation for the Governor's Office of Student Achievement, and they're an independent agency. They don't report to the state school superintendent. The head of the GaDOE, the Governor's Office, is appointed by the Governor. So GaDOE and the Georgia Department of Education have agreed to a structure that sets those targets and provides for a second look. There's another important distinction here now as we talk about the differences between the two. The first difference we noted, if we can review very quickly, involves school level governance. We have to have school level governance. The charter, we can have it or we don't have to have it so formalized in investing in educational excellence. That's a very important difference. GaDOE is the second difference. If you utilize investing in educational excellence, GaDOE will be at the table. We used to call it the negotiation table, although when you see what we have tonight, it's not so much negotiation, but they will be there. And they will have almost exclusive purview over looking at the targets, assessing the targets, making recommendations to the State Board of Education in terms of whether or not a school made its targets or met its targets. It's very important, GaDOE's role, and that's not a bad thing. That is not a bad thing. The head of GaDOE is a lady named Martha Ann Todd. Martha Ann Todd used to be a teacher during the time I was superintendent in the Thomaston Upson schools. She is a great educator. She's been in the trenches. She knows about instruction. She knows intrinsically the nuts and bolts of instruction. She's been a school administrator. She was assistant superintendent at school district. She knows what we're doing. She knows the ups and downs of education, and she knows what we go through each and every day. So she is a practitioner. It's a good thing to have her at the table. So the accountability measures are the same no matter the number of waivers requested by the district. Another important distinction between the two. If you select charter, you basically get freedom from everything in this book with a few exceptions. By default, you get everything in this book with a few exceptions by default. If you choose IE2 investing in educational excellence, you conceivably, in the abstract, have just as much flexibility. But you have to call out the laws or the rules that you want. If you wanted class size, you would have to say in your application, Pickens County would like relief from the class size rule. Pickens County would like relief from the personnel require rule, 65% rule, et cetera, et cetera. You would call those out. So again, it's conceivable in the abstract that you would have just as much in one as the other. But the difference is, you don't have to call them out under charter, you do have to call them out and enumerate them in IE2. That last slide is just say, get as many as you can, school board members. If you're going through this exercise, this cumbersome exercise to have a contract, and just because you call it out doesn't mean you have to use it. So if you had class size, you wouldn't have to use it, but it's there if you needed it. If you had 65% rule, it's there if you need it, but you don't have to use it. So this is the way it would work on the accountability side, and that's why I said it's really not so much of a negotiation because it's pretty cut and dried. So the agreement with GaDOE, the Lieutenant Governor's Office, the State Board of Education, and the State School Superintendent, it goes like this on the College Career Ready Performance Index. without the inclusion of challenge points, and the only reason we do that is just to have apples and apples comparison, so we can compare everyone equally, so there will be no challenge points. That schools in Georgia can get bonus points for doing certain things. We don't count those, again, just for comparative reasons. So the baseline year will be the 2015-16 school year. That's the baseline year. That's the year we'll have milestone test scores. Those are the test scores we will use in the contract. That baseline year will apply to districts entering contracts effective in both 15-16 and 16-17. Now again, if you're thinking, well, how could that be? Well, it's very conceivable with the number of districts who are applying for an IE2 contract that it might be our fault at the department. We just couldn't process them in time. So we might have to push them, but we would certainly not penalize the district if it's because of our inability to process that they didn't have their contract executed. Now it's a good time to talk about this before I actually go into the exercise, since it just, my memory was just jogged about this. The requirement, the legal requirement that your board has to fulfill. Now I've talked about an executed contract, but you don't have to have an executed contract by June 30th, 2015. You only have to have a letter of intent. You have to notify the department of your intent. You have met the legal requirement once you have done that. Whether it's charter system, whether it's IE2, or if you're going to do status quo and you have your public meeting saying that you'll be status quo, you've met the intent of the law at that point. Here's the way the example works though. Assume a school's baseline college career ready performance index score, again without the challenge points, was a score of 60. The perfect score being 100. I know we have some math students back there, so if you take the 60 from the 100, then you're left with 40. There's a 40-point gap there between the actual score and the perfect score. So the target, again, is no negotiation. It's just 3% of that gap annually. 3%, in this case, of 40 is 1.2 points, annually increasing the baseline. So if a school's baseline was a score of 60, then year one, their target would be set at 61.2. Year two would be 62.4. Year three would be 63.6, et cetera, et cetera. So the targets are set based on 3% annually of the gap. Now, there's another possibility that exists that may affect Pickens County. I know it affects some districts, and I'll just use Forsyth County. Forsyth County, as you may or may not know, is a very, very highly, their test scores are very high. They're a high-achieving county. They're considered consistently, year in, year out, a 90th percentile and above every year. And that's a good thing to have. But the bad thing about that is it's hard to hold at that rate. That's a very difficult thing to do with a changing population. To hold your group, different subject area, different grade levels, different content areas, different students, to hold everyone at the 90th plus percentile. So GoSub put this caveat in there. So schools with initial college career ready performance scores in the top quartile of the state within each grade cluster will be required to maintain or improve that level of performance. So that school would simply have to maintain their status. They would have to stay in that top quartile. So the targets for the school that reached this threshold in any year will remain at that same threshold. And this is the way it would work in the example. The College Career Ready Performance Index, again without challenge points for comparative purposes, is 84.2, and the top quartile score is 81.5. So the school must remain at the top quartile, continually to improve its CCRPI score. So it could not drop below 81.5. But as long as it's 81.5 or greater, it's meeting the terms of its contract. This is important too. Schools demonstrating a trend of improvement and meeting the equivalent of 3 years of targeted improvement by the end of the contract will be deemed as meeting the accountability requirements of the contract. Now what does a trend mean? Well, we're construing a trend to mean 3 consecutive years. So if in fact a school has 3 consecutive years of 3% growth, year 1 was 3, year 2 was 3, year 3 was 3, year 4 was not, year 5 was not, the school meets the terms of its contract. Maybe it's year 2, 3, and 4 that they met the 3% each year. Or maybe 3, 4, and 5. As long as they've got 3 consecutive years of having 3% growth, that school would meet the terms of its contract. So they can meet it in several ways. they can meet it on face value just by year 5. Year 1, they didn't make it. Year 2, they didn't make it. Year 3, they didn't make it. Year 4. Year 5, they hit it. They met the terms of their contract. The second way is this trend of improvement. The third way is this beating the odds. Now, beating the odds is new to the people in investing in education last day. It's not new to charter. They've been using it for some years. Basically, it's another metric. It's something offered by GOSA. They don't have to do it. It's not in law, but Martha and Todd, the head of GOSA, has said this would be something that she would want to do for the districts. So it works like this. They would look at any school, say in Pickens County, compare that school to all other comparable schools in the state, similar demographics, similar descriptive characteristics. And if that school was doing better than all those others statewide, then that school would be deemed as meeting the terms of its contract. So there are basically 3 ways that a school can meet the terms of its contract under IE squared. And the goal of each waiver and variance shall be improvement of student performance, and the requested waivers must include, and that's in law, one of the big 4. Remember what the big 4 are: class size, expenditure control, salary schedule, and certification. So they have to include one. If we were to look at the contracts that are actually executed, those being Gwinnett, Forsyth, and Raven, you'll see that there are multiples in there. There are at least 3 of the big 4, and I think in 1 or 2 cases there may be all 4. Again, their thought was, if we're going through this process, let's get as much as we can get. I said earlier there were some things that are not waivable, and you would think that to be the case, and you would hope that to be the case, and intuitively it would be the case. You can't waive, if a flexibility contract, anything federal, because federal law trumps state law. You also can't waive anything state rule, state guideline, state guidance, or state board rule that would impede or impair student health or safety. So you can't do any harm to the health or safety of a student, and you can't get beyond anything that's federal. For instance, an individual education plan. That would be just as sacrosanct after the execution of the contract as it was before the execution of the contract. So nothing would change. You cannot waive those. There's some other things as well. I'll let you read those inside the rule: conflicts of interest, court orders, etc., etc. So there are other things that are just unwaivable. This is where, when I used to do this years ago, this is the slide that people really didn't like. They did not like this one. This is in law. This was enshrined in law. These were the consequences for IE squared districts. If the schools did not meet the terms of the contract, consequences had to be imposed, and here they were. Again, these are spelled out in the law that was proposed, that was passed by the Senate, that was passed by the House, and signed by the governor in 2008. There they are, number 1, 2, and 3. Dr. Perry, those are things that I would not like to go to my board and talk about. We have a school that didn't meet the terms of its contract. Here's what we have to do. But, ladies and gentlemen, because those words in italics were there, because those words, but shall not be limited to, those words clearly implied to me and others that the Georgia General Assembly contemplated something besides 1, 2, and 3. We just didn't know at the department what they looked like, and we didn't know if GOSA had an idea what they thought it looked like, and if they did, what might it look like in the governor's office. We just didn't know. So we got together and talked about it. Well, what might they be looking for that would meet this statute? That would be, the fidelity would be there, but we could get beyond 1, 2, and 3 that are so egregious. So we collectively, State Board of Education, State School Superintendent, Lieutenant Governor's Office, and the Governor's Office came up with a 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. So here's number 4. The non-performing schools could have governance reduced by being required to submit a remedial action plan for local board approval before the school can implement necessary changes. Number 5, the school could be required to make leadership or faculty staff changes, including replacing leaders, faculty staff, or other aggressive professional development plan. Number 7, a more egregious version of number 5. Number 7, the school could be required to develop individual student achievement plans and implement programs such as after-school and or Saturday tutoring programs that provide additional time on task and subjects specified in individual plans. Now some of you, those of you that are educators, some of you are looking at that and say, that language looks familiar. I've seen that before, and you probably have. That came right out of school improvement. So we didn't reinvent the wheel. We took something that already existed and we applied that to this process as a school plan for a school that's struggling. This is what a school that's struggling is something that you could do with that school that is struggling. Now also, because we came up collectively with a number 4, 5, 6, and 7, we thought, well, maybe there's something else out there. Maybe there's something that we didn't contemplate. Maybe there's another consequence or remedy that a district might proffer to the state board. This is unique. This district couldn't succeed because, and here's what we would want to do to remediate. So we included a number 8. It's open-ended. Other options for loss of governance not listed above that address the specific reasons for schools failure to meet its targets could be proposed in the application. Again, could be proposed. The state board might turn that down. But certainly, I think if it were reasonable, if there was a persuasive and compelling narrative going along with that, I think the state board would give it favorable review. And then again, for any loss of governance option presented above, the local board would certify to the state board that such loss of governance have been imposed, and the remedial action plans imposed by the non-performing schools by the local board as a loss of governance option must address the specific reasons for schools' failure, be of sufficient. You have to give them enough time for necessary change to be made. And then board members and superintendent, what I like best is that third check mark. That's what I like best, because that puts the judgment back with you. Because to me, it's a big difference. Clarify the link between the amount by which a school target was missed and the severity of the remedial action plan. That gives you the ability to be proportionate. To me, it would be very different if at the end of the day or at the end of the contract I had a school that missed its target by 1 point. Well, I'm thinking that's a school improvement plan. That's an aggressive professional development plan. That's not so much. But it'd be far different if that school missed their target by 15 or 20 points. Something more would need to take place with that school. But that gives you the ability now to make those proposals based on what that school is doing. So if you see what happened here, it's a bit subtle, but here's what happened. So let's think about that. You see, number 1, 2, and 3, again, as I said, it was important that we maintain fidelity to the statute. So clearly the Georgia General Assembly looked for a loss of governance. So there's a loss of governance here in number 1, 2, and 3, but where does that loss take place? It takes place at the system level, But if you look at 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, where does that loss take place? At the school level. So you've minimized or you've impeded the governance at the school level. So it's back with you, where you make the recommendations, you provide the remedy for those schools that are struggling. And the application, just to say this to you, this is primarily for your Board of Education and your superintendent. But the state board operates with a committee system. We have a charter committee, we have a budget committee, and a rules committee. And because the flexibility contracts are really about school improvement and being innovative and doing more, setting higher goals and targets for schools, that we thought it would be good for a common committee to look at all this, because the Forsyth, Gwinnett, and Raven County contracts actually went to the rules committee and all the charters go to charter. Now everything flexibility will go to this charter committee that's been renamed the District Flexibility / Charter Committee. So everything goes there. So having said that, the application process will be very similar, whether you do charter or whether you do investing in educational excellence. The questions on your application will be very similar. There'll be minor differences based on the model that you choose. They're not easy questions to answer. In fact, I would submit to you they're rather difficult questions. They will challenge your district. They'll challenge your staff to look at the challenges that your district has, the obstacles, what's keeping you from exceeding. What could you do differently to do better? To triage and prioritize those challenges and obstacles and put them in order so that, again, you can leverage resources and apply your money and your talent and your human resources and capital to those areas that have the greatest need. I'll let you look at number 4, 5, and 6 in the application, 7 and 8. Now we'll move to charter system. I won't take nearly as much time on charter system simply because there hasn't been that many changes, but we do need to talk about this. Georgia law makes it clear that schools within a charter system remain under the control and management of a local board of education. This means that although the superintendent and local board must give consideration to the recommendations and input of the local school governance teams, the local board ultimately retains its constitutional authority. That's a very important principle, Many times as I go do this presentation, people ask me, well, how can that exist? How can you have an autonomous school level governance team and a local Board of Education? It's very easy. This Board of Education trumps everything. They're the final arbiter. They have that power and authority because of the Constitution of Georgia. So certainly if you have charter and you have strong and aggressive and very good quality school governance teams, certainly they'll make recommendations, and I would believe that this board would give consideration to those recommendations. But at the end of the day, they don't have to accept those recommendations. Just like even with Dr. Perry, she can make recommendations, but even now they're not required to accept those recommendations. So that's important to know that, and it's not just in statute, it's actually in the Constitution of Georgia. And if you look closely, you see those very strong words there: control and measure the school district. These are constitutional officers. So they do have, and as I tell constituents that call sometimes, I say, well, really, do the boards have that much authority? And I always say yes. Think about it, in any community, in any county, what group of people has the ability to levy taxes? This is a very, very powerful group of people. So the local board has to propose an acceptable amount of the local school governance decision-making authority to win or to gain state board approval for a charter system contract. The law requires districts to maximize school level governance. The agreement reached on an acceptable amount of local school governance team-making authority is included in the contract. So you'll know that in advance. You'll know what that decision-making agreement is if you choose that delivery model. There's a matrix that I can give access to your board and to Dr. Perry that helps you with that. And again, this has to have teeth. This is not, again, going back to a school council, which is an advisory council. This is more than an advisory council. This is a governance council, a governance team. So they would have input into every aspect of the school. You'll see in letter A, in personnel. You'll see in letter B, finance and budget. You'll see in letter C, teaching and instruction. You'll see in letter D, school improvement. You'll see in letter E, all school operations. They'll be talking about whether or not reading is offered before lunch or after lunch. Those are decisions. They will be able to have some input on all those operational decisions, the master schedule included. Not a lot here under status quo. As I went around the state and talked about status quo, a lot of districts expressed disgust with just the term status quo. They didn't like it. They said, well, if we declare, and the law prescribes that if you decide not to engage in a flexibility contract, then you have to declare yourself to be status quo at a public board meeting. And many boards of education superintendents said that's just an attempt to humiliate us, and we don't want to do that because it implies that we don't want to do anything, we're not innovative, we just want to stick our head in the sand and let everything go by. We don't want to do anything. So that's, at some point, that's where I think Representative Coleman heard that and may prompt a change in the name to something like traditional funded school system. But not a lot's changed. The big question has always been though, once you get there, once you let the June 30, 2015 date go and it's gone and you're on the other side of that date and you find out you need a waiver, can you get a waiver? That's the big question. And you know, in our business, in the education business, it's very hard to get a straight yes or no answer. This is no exception. By and large, the answer would be no, but there are always nuances, there are always differences. So let's talk about those briefly. School systems that elect not to request increased flexibility must remain under all current laws, rules, regulations, and policies. The assumption here, a key assumption here, is that making that election did not in itself create the hardship, that Dr. Perry and her finance people have to get together, they have to look at their revenue streams, they have to look at their fund equity, they have to look at their expenditure projections. It's a calculated decision if you were to do that, so it's very important that you don't create a hardship by letting the June 30th, 2015 date come and go without giving serious consideration to flexibility. But should unforeseen and subsequent circumstances arise that create a hardship for a status quo system, the state board may approve waiver requests made in accordance with OCGA. I said earlier, that's official Code of Georgia annotated OCGA 20-2-244 and or 5013 9.1. Now, I'm going to tell you what those mean. That 244, that statute there, that's the way that you've gotten class size now. Whatever class size you have now is granted by the State Board of Education. It's a blanket grant from the State Board to every district in Georgia. And basically, this board, the local Board of Education, makes that decision. If we want to allow ourselves to go up, again, they don't have to do it, but they can do it. If they want to go up 1 student or 2 students in grades 9 through 12, or grades 4 and 5, whatever, they can do that if they want to. The State Board doesn't require them to do that. The resolution and the waiver, the blanket waiver, just allows a local board to do that for financial relief. So they can do that, and they've had that ability to do that for several years now. But that ability is rapidly going away and may have already gone to do that. Now 5013-9.1 is very generic. That's the administrative procedure rule, and if you don't recognize that, you can get waivers through that. It applies to other agencies besides the State Board of Education, any state agency actually, but it's really for a person who believes they have been agreed by a state board rule or state law. Now, where you see this most often in our area at the State Department of Education is any student over the last several years, if they didn't pass a section or sections of the Georgia High School graduation test, that was the tool they've used to apply for that waiver, was 5013-9.1, the Administrative Procedure Act. And again, the waiver can be granted if the status quo system can demonstrate a hardship within the context that it elected to remain under all current laws, rules, regulations, policies, and procedures. And we define a substantial hardship there. And the State Board of Education may approve the class size waiver only in those limited circumstances where educationally justified. And again, that goes to the local board's ability to create a persuasive and compelling case to the state board. And or act of God or other unforeseen event that led to the precipitous rise in enrollment within the school system. Now, if you're thinking, well, what might that look like? Well, let's just think about that. What might something look like that would be unforeseen, that would have been unpredictable, that would really impair the district's ability to deliver instruction? Here's what it might look like. Let's say there was a small school district, let's say it was in rural Georgia, and in rural Georgia, this small school system had one big factory, one very large factory. And let's say 40% of all the really good jobs were at that one factory in that small school system or in that small county in South Georgia. But let's say, unfortunately, that corporate headquarters wasn't in that county. Let's say corporate headquarters was in New York. And the superintendent gets a call on a Friday afternoon from New York saying, we're closing that factory, those jobs are moving to China. So we need to do what you need to do to help us make this happen, because that revenue won't be there. Well, then Dr. Perry and her finance people are really stepping it up now, because they realize that that might mean 4, 5, 6 mills of tax money that has to be made up. Those are the kind of things that I think that the state board would entertain in the way of granting a waiver. We've already talked about that, and this goes back to the entities that you cannot get without a flexibility contract. So you can't get expenditure control. I've already talked to you about that. That doesn't cause me, it probably wouldn't cause your board and your superintendent so much heartburn, because there are other ways that you can comply with that rule. You can't get certification requirements, and you can't get salary schedule requirements unless you go through a flexibility contract. Then we define a financial exigency. This is outdated. This is not up to date. As I said earlier, there are 40 plus now letters of intent for IE squared. There are 4 approved executed IE squared contracts, and there are 28 approved charter systems. Now, it's important to know this, too, board members. You may have this question. Well, what about the people that have already elected charter system, or the people that have already elected investing in education? By and large, I would say to you, they seem to be pleased with what they selected. I say that because they've asked to renew their contract. Gwinnett County has asked to renew their contract. Forsyth has asked to renew their contract. Several of the charter systems have asked to renew theirs. So it seems that districts, whatever their selection was on the front end, they seem to be pleased with their selection. This is just a side-by-side that gives you a little better idea of the differences. I've already talked about that, so I won't go in any great detail there. Again, side-by-side chart. The contractual partners, I didn't talk about that, but let me talk about that very quickly. These are two-party contracts, either the IE squared or the charter system are both two-party contracts, meaning it would be a contract between the Pickens County Board of Education and the State Board of Education. There would be 4 signatures on that contract. If we looked at Forsyth, Gwinnett, or Raven, we would see that it would be the local board chair, the local superintendent, the state board chair, and the state superintendent. Two-party contracts. They're all for 5 years, whether you do charter or whether you do investing in educational assets. They're 5-year contracts. I've already talked about the process, very similar. This is the code sections, and I think someone said earlier maybe that you do have to go to different sections of the code because the flexibility status quo portions are all over here on the far left side, 20-2-80 through 20-2-84.4. You see that in status quo, they're all in that part. Of course, that happened during the Sonny Perdue regime. The other section, you know, there's a very strong champion for charter schools in the state capitol. That's 20-2-2062 through 20-2-2071. So 2 different sections of the statute that govern both of those delivery models. And ladies and gentlemen, I've done about all I can do for you in terms of what I know about the process. And Dr. Perry and members of the board, I'll be glad to entertain any questions that you may have.
I just want to again say thank you, sir, for everything that you do for all the children of the state of Georgia.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure.
Going to need to go this way. I'm pretty sure that several of the board members want to ask questions. The biggest one I want to ask, and make sure that I understand it correctly, because maybe y'all don't know, but the Board of Education has been studying this for about 1.5 years. It's changed a lot, but we have. The reason why you don't show a lot on the charter in this slide, from what I understand, is there's just very subtle differences between IE squared and charter. I mean, whichever one you choose are both flexibility. There's just very subtle differences. So basically everything that you went over in IE squared holds true for charter except for the differences that you pointed out.
Right, and the governance.
Right, okay.
School governance.
All right. So that's one thing I wanted to make sure in my own mind that I was clear on. Do you have any questions that you'd like? Next board member I think that wants to ask some questions is Mr. Bell, but you're going to have to come this way so it doesn't give back feed.
I've got several, but since I'm a new board member, some of these things I've been reading, they may be common knowledge to the school system, but it's new to me, so just bear with me, and I apologize if some of this stuff is not, seems elementary. And some of the slides that you showed here today, when you presented this to us in December, there were some slides missing, and some of these questions come from that, and it may or may not be relevant at this point. Talking about GOSA and the role and the target setting, it states that their role is target setting. You said it works sort of as a combination. When I read this here, it almost is like they are doing the goals for us. Is that how it is, or what input do we have in the IE squared model, and what input will they be? And I don't want to say forced, but are we going along with what they say, or is our input there as well?
You know, that's a great question. And the first 3 contracts were very different because I was part of the Forsyth and the Raven County contract. And there really was a lot of give and take on those. Now, I'm going to tell you again, you said I would talk to you very frankly, and I will. Those are very cumbersome contracts. They are very, I didn't say this to the group, but if we had the Gwinnett County contract in front of us, it's 9 inches to 12 inches thick, literally. It's huge. because at that time we were dealing with all the grade levels, all the content areas, all the subgroups, and there were different data templates for every one of those. The new system that I find far better, and I believe is the reason that many districts have now chosen IE2, is the simplicity of using the CCRPI. Just the simplicity. Because what happens with the CCRPI, and even if the test changes, even if milestone changes, it's still going to be incorporated in that College Career Ready Performance Index. So it wouldn't necessitate a change in the contract necessarily. But the good thing about that is now the school plans can almost be put on one page, as opposed to those 30 or 40 page documents that each school had to do. So again, was a lot more negotiation. Let's see what do you want and we'll give you this much for it. As you saw tonight, GoSA now has it's just across the board, 3% per annum improvement, 3% of the gap, not 3% overall, but 3% of the gap per year. So it's pretty cut and dry now. So it's not as much negotiation now as it was under contract 1, 2, and 3. But Cobb County went through this exercise with the 3%.
Also, the specified minimum targets each year, of course, goes hands in hand with the question I asked before. That's the same.
It would be just as I presented there. If assuming that score, baseline score was a 60, then the calculation is just a 3%, 3%, 3%, 3%, 3%.
There are other ways to meet that. You don't necessarily have to do that 1.5 and 1.2 every year, as long as you reach it by year 5.
It is, and I think the great point. I think that was Gus's point. That yeah, we're going to control this 3%, but in doing that, we're going to give you 3 different ways to meet the terms of your contract. So they never said that, but that's the way I've internalized what happened.
But I'm understanding under charter, is it still the same 3%? Ultimately, it's much more flexible.
It is. It's really going back to the beating the odds, seeing how well you did against yourself year to year, and or how well you did against other schools with similar demographics and similar descriptive characteristics. It's a different model. But yes, it's not the 3% per year. It's beating the odds and how well you did against yourself from previous years.
But beating the odds is also included in IE2 now, right?
That's correct. That's the third way that you can meet the terms of your contract. That GoSA puts up, again, they're not required to do that, but they put that up.
In this top 3 of the loss of government options, those first 3, in that number 2, it says operation of a school by a successful school, meaning you wouldn't be limited to, but operation of a school by a successful school system as defined by GoSA. What is that definition?
We've never gotten to that, but here's the way I think it would play out. I think that, let's just say that it was Raven County, and that's not the case because Raven County does pretty well, but they had a school that didn't meet the terms of their contract and they proposed to the state board and to GoSA, well, since we haven't been able to do it, we would like to contract with Towns County. And it would have to be acceptable to GoSA for that to take place. Now this is just me, I think a lot of that becomes moot because of number 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 now. So I'm hoping that we never have to test that. As I said earlier, Dr. Perry, those are consequences I wouldn't want to go to my board and talk about.
But that is, because it is open to that is a possibility.
It's a possibility.
And I'll throw this out here and you can tell me if I'm on the right track about what that potentially could mean. Would that mean that an individual school within our district could go to be under control by a neighboring school district that's defined by GoSA as being successful?
It is conceivable. Now, as far-fetched as that sounds, and I know that does, but that's not unheard of. We even now in Georgia have had a history of some systems, and I'll just use Chattahoochee County for an example. They're a very small district. They only, at one time, I think they have changed in recent years, but at one time, all their K through 8 students were educated in the Chattahoochee County school system. They were so small, they contracted with Muskogee County, a neighboring county, to have 9 through 12. So it's not unheard of, but it's unheard of in this situation, where it was because of performance. In that instance, it was simply because it was more expedient and more efficient for the district to do that.
Would that be a decision that the district made, or would GoSA make that for us?
Well, I think that Towns County, if that were the case in the example I have, Towns County would certainly have to agree. But I think as a consequence, I think that the district could proffer, we would prefer not to do that. We would prefer to have a private entity, or we would prefer to go to a conversion charter school. Certainly more than that. It's conceivable, but not likely.
Also in the IE squared application process, when you have the numerical sequence of the process, and it talks about the district conducting a public hearing to share the application with the public and receive comments. And then, of course, that's number 4 on my list. And then number 5 is district finalizes and submits the application to the Georgia Department of Education. Number 6 is the Georgia Department of Education Legal Services Division inserts targets and waivers into the IE squared contract template. Are those targets, do we know what those targets are prior to the public and community knowing, so that this is not something that once we submit it, then it's established, then the public knows about it?
Great question. Let's talk about the timeline for just a minute, because you did mention something that I didn't mention. There's a requirement if you do IE squared that there be a public hearing. There has to be a public hearing, which could be part of a regular board meeting, by the way, but you have to declare it and advertise it as a public hearing. That public hearing has to take place sometime between the letter of intent and the final submission. There's probably, I'm thinking, a lot of give and take between those two dates, where if your district chose to do that, you would send us your draft application, we would look at that. But again, think about this just operationally. Most districts, and I didn't say this is a good time to bring this up, most districts that I'm talking to are saying, what we want to do is go ahead and comply with the law. We want to go ahead and get our letter of intent, knowing full well that we're not going to have an executed contract by June 30th. But we want to spend all of next year, or as much as we can of next year, really fully developing and internalizing, working through those things that you said, working through our strategic plan, prioritizing our goals and challenges, making sure we do a good job. In that scenario, I think it would be very easy that you would know everything. You would have all the data in front of you. You would see what those targets were. You would have the baseline, assuming that we get the baseline data, because all the targets are contingent on getting that baseline. Once we get the baseline, we can plug in all the targets.
Moving to the charter, I'm a little up in the air about when it talks about the increased academic accountability, and I think maybe she was touching on that academic accountability right there. Is that going to fall under the CCRPI when we're talking about accountability? And if ours, of course, the IE squared is very easy to understand. What do we move into in a charter system as far as that type academic accountability?
Good question. Again, there are a couple ways that can take place. One is through the CCRPI, where you could say, well, we've scored at 62 this year on the CCRPI as a charter school within a charter system, but we've improved. We've gone up 4 points. And year 2, our goal is to maybe go up another 4 points. So you have that ability, and you also have the beating the odds under charter system, where again you're looked at similar to IE squared, where you just looked at how your school does, not district, but how your school does compared to every other school. Now, one other thing I probably need to say, and this is a more subtle difference between the two, but since you raised that question, it's a good time to bring this up. It's another fundamental difference between the two operation systems, or the two flexibility systems. If you use IE squared is really about a school level analysis. It really is. It's a school level analysis. Because let's take Gwinnett County with 130 schools, 170,000 students. 1/10 of every student in this state, all the students in this state go to the Gwinnett County school system. So let's say if there are 130 schools, let's say 125 met the terms of their contract. Well, I think that's good. I think 125 out of 130 is really good. But under IE squared, guess what? Those 5 schools that didn't meet the terms of their contract, there still has to be consequences / remedies imposed. As opposed to charter, where you wouldn't necessarily have to do that. That same group that reviewed those and looked at those CCRPI, looked at the beating odds, might just internalize that differently and do just what I did on the front end, say 125 out of 30, are you kidding? We're going to go ahead and recommend them for renewal. So again, more subtly, the analysis level in I-squared is clearly the school. Under charter, it really becomes the system. So you have more of a system analysis under charter, more of a school analysis under I-squared.
Still under the charter, in the local school governance, it says in the first year, charter systems must allow their local school governance teams to be the decision makers in all 5 of those areas, and I won't read those all out aloud. But A, basically recommend principal and school leader for selection by the local Board of Education, and then of course it goes through the inputs of school budget, curriculum, the accompanying materials, school improvement goals, and then of course the operations of the schools. When I read that, that's very strong powers that first year your local, the school governance teams would have. How would that, am I reading that the local Board of Education would sit back for a year during this process, or how would that take place for that first year?
Great question again. Ideally, and again, systems that have chosen charter, for the most part, the starting point has been the school council because they're already in place and there's already a template for that. Many times they add additional people to that. Now the requirements that we have, and I've talked to Lou Ersty a lot about this, is because it is about flexibility, it's about the uniqueness of the system and what you want to do in your system. So we try to step back and not be prescriptive because it is about flexibility. So the last thing we want to do is be prescriptive. So what we do is basically say this, that the principal or central office staff cannot be a voting member of that local school governance team. They cannot be. Other people, other community people, other teachers, other business and industry people, however you select that group, they will be the voting members. And the only other thing that we require is that that group, that local school governance team, must reflect the diversity of the population they're serving. Other than that, they can do what they want. Now, back to your question, or trying to get more square to your question, what does that do for you as you sit there and you get these recommendations? So I think it's incumbent, this is just me, I'm editorializing to some degree, but having been a superintendent, I've often thought, how would I do that? How do you manage an autonomous local school governance council with a Board of Education who can trump everything? So I think it puts a greater onus on the Board of Education to communicate with that local school governance council and all the governance councils and say to them, here are some parameters, here are some boundaries, and we'll accept. You can bring any recommendation, but just understand school councils, if you bring recommendations to us within these parameters, within these boundaries, we'll do our best to try to comply. We'll do our best to try to accept those recommendations. But if not, it can get very problematic, because I could conceive if you, Dr. Perry, have a reading series and it's sequential and the school wants to get out of bounds with that, you probably don't want to do that. And your board might want to say, no, that's not in line with the reading series that we have, so we really prefer that you do that. That would be a parameter. You can bring us things, but please bring us things within these parameters.
Now, what you just described is sort of how I envision year 2 on. Is that still true for that first year when it specifies very clearly to me, but almost the description was year 2.
And when I send you the matrix relaxes that a little bit. It does give you a little more time to get everything in place. So when you see the matrix, and you'll know that on the front end, you'll adopt that governance model on the front end. So before it's put into your contract, you clearly know what your expectation is.
Charter also, I think you've covered this a little bit as far as the student performance goals must meet contract goals and exceed state averages and previous system performance. Right. So yeah, I think you covered that.
We've got to continue to do better.
Also with the, and I think you tapped in a little bit of the curriculum, and then talking about the programs that are already in place. If you went into charter, the individual schools, when those governance teams, if they want, different programs? What about stuff that's already in place, maybe stuff that we just received a grant and we've got programs in place now with sustainability there? What trumps what when you start getting into what the individual school under the charter system, what they want versus what's already in place?
And at the end of the day, the board trumps everything. But again, I think that's where you, as a Board of Education, and that's why communication, not that it's not important under I2, because truly it is, it's important everywhere, but it will be very important in charter to be sure you're communicating, or representatives of the district are communicating with the local governance teams to be sure that we have this grant. Now again, we want to be as flexible as we can, and we'd like as many recommendations as you can give to us, but we can't get outside the boundaries of this money. We can't do that because, let's say it's a federal grant. Well, certainly you can't do that.
In the last one, also what it's talking about in the IE2, that we could give the local, your student advisory councils, of what it would be under that.
Yes.
We can give them more power.
Absolutely.
When is there a time when you cross that threshold to where all of a sudden they go from an advisory council to a governance team, or is there a defined line there?
There's not, and to be honest, I think that could happen. It's conceivable that that could happen, that the same authority that you have to have in charter, that you as a board could voluntarily concede as a board and say, here, we want you to have that much. It's conceivable, but again, you're under no obligation to do that under IE2.
Does that put you in a position to where the governance teams have to be trained annually? When can you stop shy of having that requirement with an advisory council?
Yeah, that's a great question too, because that leads to something else. There is required training, and I didn't mention that for school governance people that serve on those governance teams. They are required now, they were required this past year by law to have some governance training. Just like your local Board of Education, these people are required to have 9 hours of training if they're veteran members. If they're new members, they have to have 15 hours of training by law. So the new school governance team members would have to have that as well. But the answer to that question is really there's no demarcation. If you elected to be chartered, then that has to take place. If you elected to be I2, if you chose and you said, well, I know they do some training for charter, we're not a charter, but we really have something like that. We'd like our local governance team or our school councils to have training. So why can't we maybe call the Georgia School Boards Association and see if they'll do a form of that training for our school councils that are almost like school governance team members? That's conceivable too.
That's all I have. I didn't
That's
mean
a
to
good
take
question.
the floor. I just had a lot of questions I wanted to make sure I asked.
Sure.
I wanted to ask about the cohort schools under beating the odds. Excuse me.
Okay. Am I going to be with you? No. Okay, good. Under beating the odds, are the cohort schools, how are they defined? Are they by eligibility, like free and reduced eligibility, population, ethnicity? They look at all of those things.
They are.
All right, do they look at per capita income? Because I know that in our county, our per capita income is pretty high, but so is our free and reduced. So I just wonder, is there a discrimination anywhere, or are we looked at equally as, and this applies to both charter and I2?
It is, and I think they do. I've actually seen the peer groups when they bring them to me, and I look at those schools and just haven't been around as long as I have. So no, those look like that's a good grouping there. Those are
so
similar.
It's pretty comparable.
Pretty similar, pretty comparable.
Thank you.
But that's a good question. You don't want to be compared with something that has an extraordinary per capita income.
True.
My question has to do with funding. In our last conference down in Atlanta, I think the majority of us sat in on one of the sessions that had some, I guess, school districts that had chosen to go charter. And they went through and they gave their I guess, their experience and the reasons why they chose to go that direction. And it seems like all the ones that we listened to were all in some sort of a financial crisis. And if I'm understanding correctly, with charter, there's some additional funding that comes to the school system for the first few years.
Great question. Great question, though, and I didn't mention that, but and it does vary year to year because it's subject to appropriation by the Georgia General Assembly. So there's some years it's been this, some years it hasn't. That money usually ranges between $80 and $100 per FD per child in the school district. So I always tell school board members this: while that does look appealing and enticing, it's a decision of such a magnitude. I'd be very cautious to let that amount of money drive a decision of that magnitude. Now, having said that, if it was a close call, if I was right on the cusp of deciding one or the other, I might go with charter just because the money does come with it.
But it only comes for 1 year.
1 year.
You said if appropriated.
If appropriate. And keep in mind this too, because it's a finite amount of money, even if it is appropriated. And let's say right now with this rush to get the contracts in, 4 or 5 very large districts lay claim to that, that money will drive very quickly.
And that was my concern when I listened to those school districts. It sounded like the majority of their decision based on they were planning to borrow that money and to have that money, and that was what was going to help them through a financial crisis. And from everything I've seen, that money's not guaranteed.
No, no.
Okay, any other board members have any? We'll try
Do
it.
you want me to, I'm pretty loud. I want to ask you about the example you used when you were talking about charter schools. You were saying that we would have the latitude, say, to take our budget, and if we identified math as a particular problem for a certain year, we can fund that at a greater level than reading. I guess my question is, through the period of time that this charter is covered, how much latitude do we have to adjust that? Suppose we make up our gap in math and we want to take our funds and move them to another area. Within the charter, do we have that latitude? And also within IE2 do we have that latitude?
Good question, and you have that complete latitude. But since you asked that, and I don't know about the time constraint, but let me give you one good example of how flexibility works. This is for the people out here, this will be a good example. Let's go back to that rural district that I was telling you about. And let's say that rural district has a school that's out in the country, and let's say it's on one parcel of land. And let's say there are actually 2 schools on that one parcel of land, and they're within a football field length of one another. And one is a K2 school with 200 students, and the other is a 3-4 school with 200 students. Well, here's the way flexibility works. Right now, both of those schools would have a school code, and having a school code, they would both be required to have a full-time principal, whether they had 200 students or 2,000 students. Am I right, Dr. Perry? Personnel required, that rule would say that. If you had flexibility, either IE2 or charter, this board, you all could sit down and you could have a discussion that went like this. You could say, golly, those 2 schools are awfully close, so we're very remote. We don't have a lot of discipline problems over there. It's just K2 and 3-4. Why don't we take the salary we're paying one of those principals, and why don't we hire a reading specialist? We need a reading specialist. Let's put those funds, because that's something that we really need that will help our students. So let's do that. And then another board member says, well, I like that idea, but what about this? What about if we just reduce the teacher-pupil ratio across the board, and let's use that money that way? Instead of having 1 to 18 in kindergarten, maybe we can get it down to 1 to 14 or 1 to 15. And then another board member says, well, I like both those ideas, but is there some maybe way we could combine this? Maybe we can do some of both. Maybe we can have a part-time reading specialist. Now, you could do everything I just said without making a phone call. No phone call, no paperwork, no nothing. You just do it because you had the flexibility to do that. So that's the way it works.
Anything else? Okay, I would like to open it up for all of y'all. Anyone have any questions? Then, got one over here.
Actually, I got a few. First is an easy one. I was wanting to find out if we could get a copy of that slideshow presentation.
Sure, it's on their desktop now.
Okay, perfect. Second question, if we choose to go to IE2, and the state does something that changes the IE2 model, requiring, say, a certain textbook to be used, can we at that time actually opt out of going IE2 and go to charter school system?
Not the way that it's currently written, but typically if a law like that does come, The General Assembly has been pretty gracious, in my opinion, to make that happen. Let's take a good example right now. Let's take a real life example. There's something going on in our state right now, Dr. Perry, called opportunity districts. You know about that. Where basically if the school is very low performing, it's in the top 20 of all the schools in Georgia, basically the state could take control of that school. Now, the question comes up, well, how does that interface? What if one of those schools is under an IE squared or charter contract? Well, they've actually covered that in the law. They trump that. That school goes. So usually those are spelled out in the statute if something like that were to happen. Now, one other thing, since you've asked that question, and this advantage may go to charter as you make your decision. If you do get a new law, let's say a new law does come up, then you would probably, if this board wanted to apply that law, they wanted to have that in their repertoire of flexibility, they would have to amend their contract. Under charter, they would not have to. You automatically, by default, you get the flexibility under default. If it's IE squared, they would have to come back. Classic case there. And when that in Forsyth County, during the time they got their contract, the House bill came up that became law called House Bill 251. It involved a local school choice. They didn't have it. They wanted. They had to, their first amendment was to claim that school choice that was passed by the Georgia General Assembly.
That brings up a follow-up then. If they do change the legislation and we have like a 5-year contract, I believe you said, does that create a new 5-year contract at that point if we had to make a change to this contract? It
would just depend on the legislation. Sometimes they put that in there, and sometimes there are a few legislators, you know, and even now, think about this, there are legislators in the Georgia General Assembly right now that are creating a lot of laws. Now again, all those laws, unless they're not federal, we know that, they probably don't impair student health or student safety, so they're probably going to be waivable laws. Now, some legislators have figured this out and said, well, let's put that in the law that is unwaivable. Let's put it in there. There's one legislator that did that with House Bill 186, the graduation law. And it's specifically in the law that you can't waive 186. So usually those things are actually spelled out in the law. They've got some people over there that really keep their eye on these flexibility contracts. They're very astute about this.
Next question. Can a school system actually have both IE squared and charter actually in the same system?
Yes. Yes, we actually have. Gwinnett actually could have a charter school if they so chose to do that. Now again, that's up to this board because you see what an onus that puts on the board and the superintendent to have people under different kinds of flexibility contracts. But conceivably, yes.
Let's see. Oh, if we go IE squared, will it allow the county to opt out of the fair share that we pay to the state?
No.
Okay. So we still pay 5 mills down?
Yes.
Yeah. How about, can you explain how teacher pay will be affected between the different models?
It just varies because number one, if they did IE squared, they'd have to claim salary schedule. So number one, they may not claim salary schedule. Number two, they may claim it and choose not to use it. If they did choose to use it, it's kind of tied with certification. It's designed to do something like this. It's designed to take someone in your community who perhaps has a Juris Doctorate, they're a retired lawyer. They don't have a teaching certificate. It would allow Dr. Perry to take that person, to bring that person forward and say to them, I understand you don't have a certificate, but you still have to go through Georgia professional standards. You still have to have a fingerprint and background check, so you're going to get a clearance certificate. And I'm going to negotiate with you off that pay scale. We're going to come off that pay scale and negotiate your contract.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you. Good questions.
Anyone else?
Hey, can I just ask, I can just shout it out. I'm just curious, this may not be a question for you, but this is a lot of information to take in.
It truly is.
It seems like we're kind of coming toward the end of when we have to decide. So when do we have to make the decision, and how does the public give their feedback? And that may be a question that maybe not you answer, but maybe some of the board members.
Well, I can answer the when part, and maybe I'll turn it over to the board, but the when is, the letter of intent is all that's required right now. And the letter of intent is due on or by June 30th, 2015. So this board has to let the State Board of Education know of their intent to do something, either IE squared or charter or status quo. They have to let the state board know. Now, as to how you, as a person in your community, a constituent, a voter, a taxpayer in your community, provide input, I'm going to go out on a limb. I think this is part of it, but I'll let you address that as well. I think that that's one of the purposes of this assembly is so that you can have the information they have and you can inform maybe the board member that represents your voting district, or inform other people that are in decision-making capacities. Is that pretty much it?
One other thing I would like to add to that is we've been discussing for a long time now about what to do. There's been so many changes that we felt it was prudent for us to wait and see exactly what the end result was going to be. And I think it is to our advantage that we have waited, because we would not have to put in amendments and go through all that. And plus the fact that it allows more time for everybody to be way more educated on the three options.
Yeah, we just have a lot of catching up to do real quick.
Couple questions, two questions. Those saying serving two masters and with the Governor's Office of Student Achievement and Georgia Department of Education, why are we in this point where we're having to do both? And you know, because a lot of that was talking about governments and both of them making decisions together. And the one point I saw where the GOSA has the advantage. Why are we in that position, and is that going to change, or will that always be the case? And then the second thing is, Georgia milestones and the curriculum changes all the time. And so, you know, they increase the rigor of the testing, and a lot of this is based on a 3%, increase in the gap. Has that been decided by those two governing bodies, how we deal with that? I guess the beating the odds gives us a chance to survive, but if they keep changing the curriculum and bringing more rigor, there's got to be something in place to make that adjustment.
Yes, sir, and I'll take the last question first. Certainly that has been discussed, but again, I think that's part of the beauty of using the CCRPI, because it transcends the assessment instrument. Now, your question about what if something is selected is a lot more rigorous, proven a lot more rigorous, then people have to go back to the drawing board, that this is not apples and apples, this is radically different. Now, just to give you an example, because this happened with the Gwinnett County model, when they had their contract, when they started their contract, we used the Georgia High School graduation test. That was the assessment. As you know, later on we began to use the EOCT as the assessment. So that was an amendment that we had to do. But using the CCRPI will certainly help, because that'll be stable. The way that index, the way that calculus is put into the formula will stay. That doesn't count for if you had an instrument that was a factor of 2, 3, or 4 more aggressive or more rigorous than the model that you're using. That would have to be taken in consideration. The serving two masters, there are a lot of political implications associated with that question. If you recall the reasons that GOSA came into being many years ago, the short answer to your question, I don't see during the time that I'm going to be at the department, GOSA is not going away. GOSA is strong, hard, and fast. And keep in mind, they don't just look at public K-12 entity. They look at DeKalb, they look at university system, they look at technical college. So their role is massive. They're not going away.
Thank you. My question is, in looking at all of your IE2 material, and you come down to boxes 1, 2, and 3, which is what the General Assembly put in. Box 1 for consequence was, we convert you to a charter system. So is there some nutshell answer that can be given as to why you don't start with a charter system if that is the number one thing that is the fallback to improve your IE2 that fails?
That's close. However, if you read that slide, it's a conversion charter school, a conversion school, which is different from a charter system school. That school, where a conversion charter school would have its own contract and its own governance. So it is a different animal. It's not another charter system school. It's a conversion charter school.
But it remains a charter school.
It does.
Both flexibility options require a contract.
That's correct.
These contracts may or may not be accepted by the state.
That's correct.
Because you choose IE2 and write the contract, you're not automatically in. Same being with charter. They have to be both approved by the state.
That's correct. That's correct. There'll be an application that will actually go to the state. The state board will actually look at your application and vote on your application in another public meeting.
Okay, now, we've talked about the timeline. We do have to declare by June 30th, but we perhaps would have a year to write our contract. So see, it's not necessarily that we have to know everything that we're going to do. I mean, we're just choosing an option at this point. And the contract writing, we have ample time to
That's
work on
correct.
that.
Many of the districts I talk to say we would like to go ahead and really begin to look at the documents. And by the way, could you maybe send us some of the Cobb County documents because they're the first one on the new platform? Could we be looking at those, looking at their consequences? And we would like to go ahead and do that maybe during the months of October, November. And we're kind of thinking about maybe getting the application, the first submission to you maybe by Christmas, maybe by January. So they've given themselves plenty of time to do this.
Hi, I had a question about the enrollment cap for the charter schools. If they choose an enrollment cap, what happens to the students that don't fit into that category?
There's really not an enrollment cap on the charter system. It really doesn't change your system to that extent. The number of students that you have, you're going to serve every one of those students. They're going to be a charter system school, which is a little different from a startup charter or a conversion charter. But every student would have an opportunity to attend the school just like they have right now. No one would be excluded.
Thank you.
So my question is, you're talking about a conversion charter school. Is that similar to the school that's set up in Cherokee County?
It is.
Okay, so that is, we are talking about doing a charter system where it's going to involve
Yeah,
all of our current schools.
That's correct. A charter system is unique to Georgia. There's nothing like it in the whole United States. It's a Georgia product. It is a charter system.
Okay, I've heard too many things and want to clarify that.
Any other questions?
If the letter of intent has to be,
Hang on, because everybody in the back can't hear you, so hang on.
if the letter of intent has to be submitted by June 30 of this year, when could you anticipate whatever the application process, when that completes itself, when would this begin, essentially?
That would be left to the district. But here's the district's challenge. Again, now I want you to know I do have a district that I'm talking to now who thinks they can get their contract executed by June 30th. They're working with me hard to get it done. They want to get it done. They're committed to get it. So we think we can do maybe 5 to 6 of those, possibly, depending on where they were with their strategic plan. Back to your question, it's really going to depend on these people, how aggressive they want to be, and what their strategic plan looks like. If it's in really, really good shape, the application process won't take nearly as long because they probably have the answer to those questions. But it really will depend on what they want to do. Because they'll probably, knowing Dr. Perry the way I know her, she's going to be very reflective, she's going to be very deliberative, she's going to be very methodical, she's going to want to go through every one of those flexibilities and think thoroughly what is it we need to do, what flexibility do we need to have to get to where we want to go. She's going to want to do that. So it's really going to depend on the district personnel.
One other question I just wanted to clarify for the group. As I understand it, whatever we opt for, whichever option, and our contract is not complete by the end of the year, we would still be allowed those waivers for next year. Those would be in place for us even though our contract is not. Or would we have to call those out and say we won't?
Now, if I understand your question right, obviously if it was on our end, let's say that you did get a submission in and it was late next year, it was maybe March or April, and it was our fault. We didn't get that in. Yes, you're entitled. We wouldn't punish you because of our inability to process that contract. Now, one other question you did raise, I did mention earlier that the state board has really expressed a willingness now, if you do have a 65% or a class size waiver, that if you've got your letter of intent, it's clear to them they know your vision, they know what you want to do, and we've already approved one of those. In fact, we're recommending Buds County for approval at the April meeting. They have, and one of the attachments to that board item will be their letter of intent. And the board knows when they see that letter of intent, we know where they're going, we know what their vision is, we're going to try to help this district.
Okay.
So they're going to act favorably for those letters of intent. So that's important.
Okay, yeah, okay, thank you.
Going back to the governance teams, is the template for the participants on the governance team, will it be the same as it would be for our advisory councils now, as far as the number of parents, number of teachers and stuff like that? Or we would determine that?
Well, and you'll put that in your bylaws, and you'll approve bylaws for those governance teams.
So it wouldn't matter if we had more teachers than parents?
That's correct, or business people. And there are lots of combinations that you can do. There are many ways that you can do that. Obviously, you want to be as democratic as possible. You could have a teacher representative elected by the teachers. You could have parents elected by the parents. You could let the Chamber of Commerce appoint 3 people. There are a number of ways that you can do this to get that representation.
Any other questions?
I have a quick question. Let me ask you, on the charter school, let me see if I have this correct. On the charter school system, a governance team is required.
It is required.
Okay, so that's an unelected body. That is a body, the governance team. The Board of Education is the end-all. You said that no matter what, they're the end-all, right? Is the superintendent the only liaison between the governance team and the Board of Education, or can the Board of Education have communication or joint meetings with the governance team?
The latter. The Board of Education makes that determination, and they may appoint, they may appoint Dr. Perry. They may say, Dr. Perry, we want liaisons to all the schools, so can you make sure we have a central office person that attends every one of those meetings? They could do it. They could say, Dr. Perry, we would like you to attend those meetings. It's really, it's a local decision.
I'm sorry, I misunderstood. The body of the board and the governance team, can they actually communicate with each other? Can a couple of the board members go to a governance team meeting, vice versa, or is Dr. Perry the total liaison between the two bodies?
Oh no, they're public meetings. These board members can go in those. They're subject to open records, and they're open meetings and subject to open records. So these board members can attend those meetings. Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
I'll go ahead and, more to your point, we already try to have at least one board member at every school council meeting. That is the way that we try to find out at the school level what they're needing from us as a school board. So some of that is already going on.
Well, I know that there are not a lot of people at this meeting, and I know that my husband and I are pretty disappointed that not a lot of people have attended this meeting for the information that will impact our students, our community, etc. And I would like to know when the board plans to make their decision, and I'd like to suggest maybe some other means of communication with the public and try to encourage people's input on this very important decision.
I'm not sure at what meeting we will discuss it. I can tell you for myself, I have ways of getting in touch with me on our website. I want the public's input. I think the rest of the board members want public input. We want teachers' input. We want principals' input. I feel like, and I feel like the board feels like, this is way too important a decision for the 5 of us to make standing all alone on the island. Okay? We need input. That's the reason for our meeting. I too am disappointed at the amount of people we have in here. We had it in here hoping that we would overflow the place. Not the case.
I think part of the problem is in the messaging. When the messages went out, it was presented as there's these 3 options, we have to decide one, but I don't think it was, and from a parent perspective that is just hearing all of this for the first time, I don't think it was presented as, we have to make decisions that are going to determine what yardsticks are going to be used to determining failing schools, that could impact personnel. I don't know that parents get how big a thing this is.
And I agree that I think some of them don't realize that. I am glad that we have 2 people here from the media that have been filming this whole thing. Please get the word out. Have everybody you know watch it so that you can be informed. I mean, in my opinion, an informed public is a good thing. So, any other questions, comments? Okay. I appreciate all of you coming. The board appreciates all you coming. Dr. Perry appreciates you coming. And please get the word out. Okay. Thank you, sir, for coming up to Jasper.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.